So, I got a really interesting review on my book. Much better than the first review I got on my book. I saved it to my phone so I could read it more rigorously. Pretty sure the person who wrote it is on my Facebook friend list. So I will say here that according to KDP, they actually bought the original, which I now consider an incomplete book, so I implore them and anyone else to give the second edition a chance if they didn't like the original or at least felt it could have been improved upon. Because I agree with you. Either way, I appreciate the positive rating and the constructive feedback. Unfortunately, shortly after it was added, it was promptly deleted. Thankfully, I saved screenshots of it before this happened so I could create an artificial dialogue with an anonymous reviewer. The first thing that needs to be understood is that I basically rushed my first edition out as fast as I could without giving much thought to how anyone would respond to it because I was desperate to tell my story. Response. It's actually pretty cool being referred to as a frustrating protagonist and having an almost total disinterest in the activities of the ship I was on. This is what somebody should take away from the book. I was a self-absorbed shithead, a vulnerable narcissist. That's actually where the confusion may arise for people when they see the title. It's not about the Navy. The Navy was the backdrop. I was the Machinator. I was separate from the world and had built a wall around myself. The book is written from the Machinator's point of view. Now the review. To synthesize, this is an autobiographical work written by someone whose frank disclosure of their mental state and, more importantly, word choices, as well as what they recollect and when give the reader a sense that they are viewing real events through a sort of funhouse mirror. And in the end, there is little payoff. That's actually a big reason I was hesitant to change anything from the first edition in the second edition. Apart from obvious grammatical errors or stylistic choices that may have come across as a lack of skill rather than a deliberate choice, I wanted to be as faithful to my younger self as I could be, despite developing a much more nuanced point of view of my time in the Navy as well as my overall past. The book isn't meant to be accurate, it's meant to be a subjective stream of consciousness portrayal of my mindset in each time period. Review. There are many examples that could be found, but in brief, the author's painful relationship with his parents is a central theme of the book, stealing many pages in a work whose title leads one to believe it's about the Navy. Reaction. The title is meant to be a bit of a spoof on old-school philosophical text like Discourse on Method by René Descartes and Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant, the latter of which I largely based the ideas behind the Machinator on, or at least indirectly. I had a cursory intuitive understanding of his philosophy, which I, when I was younger, gleaned from a book about philosophy and video games. Basically, if we have little autonomy in a deterministic universe, we can act mechanically in such a way to achieve a desired outcome, a gambit. I was also an enlisted sailor at the time, which speaks to the boldness of a squid. Kant is also a notoriously bad writer, which I now figure gives me a bit of leeway if I falter at times. You can't really expect a well-rounded, objective point of view from a book that's claiming to be subjective. I could have spoken in the third person, given a well-rounded perspective, but that wouldn't have been well suited to the perspective of a 25-year-old subject, in this case the protagonist, the then me. You almost have to think of me in terms of a listless directionist Holden Caulfield or even a Charlie Gordon who's been burned by the bright lights outside the cave walls. I rarely wrote about the Navy because I rarely thought about the Navy in the sense of the big picture, and that's true for most sailors. For the average sailor, you have no reason to concern yourself with the mission. Your mission is to wake up, show up to quarters in the proper uniform, then perform your assigned task, which for technical rates usually consists of cleaning dust off of a filter. By the time I was a senior technician, we had a foam mattress in my space and I would spend my mornings sleeping in my space until lunch, then would finish all of my work for the day after lunch. That was my world. Our lives were highly streamlined. We were cogs in a machine. Why would we care about the bigger picture? We had no control over our fate. That would only bring unnecessary stress. Review. Some of the interactions with his parents are heart-wrenchingly traumatic, but a few pages later, a trivial example of some sort of bickering that occurs in every family will be given almost the same level of gravity. Reaction. That's simply how my brain works, and I wanted to express my mindset in as unfiltered a manner as possible. I was intended to be impressionistic at the time of writing much of the book, as I was still in the midst of family turmoil. And even at the final parts of my book, I was still only a couple years out of therapy and was still in a purging mindset. The thing is, the egocentrism needs to be understood as the autistic point of view. Review. It gives the reader the impression that the author has never forgotten or forgiven any slight that they ever perceived. Reaction. Aspies and autists are like pen cameras. We capture everything. Maybe it's good to keep that in mind. It's not easy for me just to forget things, and for narcissists, it's good to be reminded that they're not the smartest person in the room. With that being said, I wrote a good chunk of the book when I was around 26 or 27. I hadn't even started therapy yet, and everything was swelling around in my head like a tumorous mud muck. Review. Whether the events seem serious or not, the author rarely gives any analysis or commentary about them. In other words, the reader is not informed what they are meant to take away from this or how it fits into the greater narrative. They can certainly assume it was unpleasant or traumatic, but what the author actually thinks of them years on is kind of a mystery. Reaction. There isn't really a greater narrative. It's mainly exposition with a bit of poetry. I was 31 when I finished writing it and was going through a major life transition. I was more concerned about getting my life up to that point on paper than thinking about a broader narrative. Much of the book wasn't written years on. It was still fresh. Much of it was written before I even went to therapy at 28. I didn't necessarily write the book to analyze everything. I wrote it down because keeping everything bottled up was causing severe psychological turmoil. I've tried to add more analysis in my second edition. With that being said, a writer's purpose is not to explain their intentions. It is to ignite the imagination of the reader, allowing them to find their own meaning in the words. As stated by Umberto Eco, the reader is a kind of collaborator in the writing of the text. Review. Ironically, it seems as though his parents are some of the only people he was ever interested in understanding. That makes sense to a certain degree. If people hurt you, understanding why they are the way they are could bring some relief and impose some order on a cruel world. Reaction. I psychoanalyzed several people in the book. I pointed out my warrant officer's serial killer tendencies and his dead cold eyes. I stated that a frequent Liberty buddy showed traits of histrionic personality disorder. I analyzed an ex-girlfriend's reasons for cheating on her next boyfriend with me, and why I forgave her once I realized that she had made the best choice she could have in her particular situation. I pointed out how my jealousy pushed away my first girlfriend. I pointed out how my desperation caused another girlfriend to lose respect for me. I don't think that's a fair point. I certainly focused more on my family than anyone else. Well, that's largely because they had the largest effect on me. Plus, at the time of writing, I was far from healing. I was still purging. A good sign that you've overcome narcissistic abuse is that you stop telling the story. You can't stop telling the story without telling it in the first place. He's also very interested in himself, going into great depth about his thoughts and feelings to a particularly unhealthy degree, but where those outside of his family are concerned, usually very little effort is given to understanding or empathizing with them. Everyone who ever crossed him, a great deal of people, is simply stupid or selfish. Reaction. I'm extremely egocentric. It's part of my biology. Granted, this is also an autobiography. The subject is me. My black and white thinking was also a very effective coping mechanism in my younger years. I addressed the term selfish directly in my second edition, as I did come to realize that it sounds a bit juvenile and hypocritical. A deficit in self-awareness is more appropriate, which also applies to me in much of the book. Review. He relays often that many of his romantic interests only really serve to satisfy his own ego with a truly stunning callousness. But as I will get to in the conclusion, whether you like it or not, a difficult protagonist has a way of making for a good, engaging reading. Reaction. I never intended to paint myself as the good guy. I was very much a covert narcissist, and much of my grandiosity was a tactic for self-preservation. Difficult protagonist is a pretty fitting analog for my personality in my 20s. Review. When someone relates a story of partying with hookers all night and plotting to rob a cell phone store to wake up the next day and find their hometown girlfriend broke up with them, and the reaction is to state that they wanted to ensure she felt guilty, without sparing even a few words about how this was hypocritical, You want to see what they will do next, basically. That's why I told the story. I was a hypocrite. I juxtaposed those stories intentionally. It's actually beneficial to look back and realize I was often a victim of my own choices, not circumstances. I had more control than I realized. Review. Another surprising element of his perception is his almost total disinterest in the activities of the ship he was on. Welcome to the life of an enlisted sailor. A good amount is written about the minutiae of shipboard maintenance that a civilian would struggle to even understand, and I imagine when a member of the general public picks up a military autobiography, they have at least some interest in how the person they are reading about fit into the bigger picture. Again, welcome to the life of an enlisted sailor. My primary concern on the ship was maintenance, troubleshooting gear, security watches, and fire drills. Review. While he was on board the same ship that I was, we pursued North Korean gun smuggling ships, did a Taiwan Strait transit right into a typhoon, had one of the first truly aggressive close aboard maneuvering interactions with the PRC close to the Philippines, got underway from Okinawa in the middle of the night because a different Chinese ship tried to pull a U.S. oceanographic survey ship's gear out of the water while most of the crew was still drunk, and had to get underway emergently on a freezing Korean night because a ferry that was dragging anchor was going to hit us if we didn't. I don't know. I tend to think at least one of these makes for a decent story. The only one of those events that I can even remember was getting recalled in Okinawa. The others were outside of my purview. Maybe the author doesn't agree, but what truly surprised me was no mention of the 311 triple disaster in Operation Tomodachi, where 7th Fleet risked irradiation to lend humanitarian aid after the Great Tohoku earthquake. Reaction. I considered mentioning it, but there wasn't much I could say about it. It was cool to see the ship come together and donate clothes, and standing phone talker in weather so cold that my feet went numb was an experience, but it had very little effect on my life, especially considering my sister's suicide occurred less than 2 months later, which had a life-altering effect on me. Review. None of these seem to be important, just a failed equipment validation and which alcoholic beverages were consumed during which port visit. There should be an emergent pattern starting to show here. On the positive side, the author does a great job of relating the feelings of being a sailor in Yokosuka during that time and relates many experiences that overall will not widely different from my own. People got treated like shit on the ship, partied and drank hard because of it, were preyed on by toxic women who frequented the haunch, many such cases, though it was far from all bad. Many of my best and worst memories are in that place, which was not so different from how one thinks of their hometown. Reaction. In other words, I did exactly what I was trying to. Review. Lastly, there is little payoff to be found. The title leads one to believe that there will be some lessons learned, some conclusions, some insight gained. For example, I wondered if he was going to say that he should have been screened for autism earlier and then prevented from joining the Navy and being in a situation that was not good for him. Or is he going to offer his thoughts on how the military could better adapt to people on the spectrum or vice versa? Reaction. As per my title, my critique wasn't of the Navy, it was of normality. I wasn't critiquing the Navy. My solution about normality was to reject it. My experience as a Navy veteran is largely what shaped that stance. The only thing I have, or even had to offer, is my own confusion. Review. But none of that is to be found. He has little to say about the Navy other than it sucks, is basically pointless and full of stupid, incompetent people who just shot down every anti-ship ballistic missile that came their way in the Red Sea. Somehow, they still got the job done. In the end, his solution is to care less about most things. That's probably a good thing, but doesn't exactly provide a satisfying narrative for the reader. Reaction. Exactly, care less about normality. The book isn't about the Navy. If anything, you should assume it's about autism because I mentioned that first. I'm pretty sure I never claimed the Navy is full of incompetent people. If anything, I stated that leadership in and of itself is poorly defined and maintained through catchphrases. The value of leadership is an overrated idea for me. I specifically said that not everyone is meant to be a leader, and there is nothing wrong with that. It's status quo as a veteran to praise the military-industrial complex and to think the ability to complete the mission is an end in and of itself. That mental health is an afterthought. That's a given. Why do I need to do that in my own book? There isn't necessarily a solution to the suck of the Navy or the military in general. Military life is always going to be difficult, but what's important is not to let the experiences you have define your sense of self-worth. Sometimes being a self-centered asshole is the right choice. Review. With all that said, while I intended to give 3.5 stars, I have to round up to 4 because Amazon won't let me do that. Why? Well, I enjoyed the hell out of reading the book. I did it in 2 days and even put off important tasks to do so. It's engaging, full of crazy stories, and makes you want to know where it's all headed, even if you might not have a great deal of faith in the accuracy of the narrator's perceptions. Reaction. Works are either going to err on the side of shallow and enjoyable or thorough and boring. I don't have all the answers. All I have is my experience.